A Forest in the Desert is a graphic novel about the life of the Christian saint John the Short. At its heart, it's a way for Christians like you to learn about the spirituality, virtues, and lives of the early Christian fathers. This 185-page book took a little over 5 years to write and illustrate. I started at a very tough time in my life for very selfish reasons. I was let go out of my very first job after university, and it took me a little over a year and a half to find anything after that. So during that time, I had very low self-esteem, and I was staying at my parents', so I felt unworthy because I couldn't contribute in any way. And so I turned to this graphic novel I started drawing every day as a way to start a routine, as a way to build my confidence, and find a purpose. And then day by day, I started realizing a bigger purpose. I started realizing very important reasons to do this. I wanted to create a book that makes the life of St. John accessible beyond a translated manuscript, that extends the ancient church iconography into sequential art and graphic novels, and that presents a very accessible story in a fun yet edifying manner. Oddly enough, I didn't set out to write and illustrate the story of St. John the Short. I wanted to make a book about St. Anthony the Great, but at the time I realized that I'm not good enough. It's my first book, and so I dug around and picked St. John the Short. And the book is largely based on an English translation of a 6th century manuscript by a bishop called Zacharias of Sacha. Bishop Zacharias actually was a monk at the monastery of St. John the Short, and that's where he learned his story and wrote down that tradition. And the toughest thing for me was creating a narrative out of that manuscript. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but if you read the lives of the Desert Fathers, you notice that the story lacks a narrative. It lacks the common story beats that we know in modern storytelling. It goes like, this saint did this, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they reposed in the Lord. And so it was very tough for me. I had to spend a lot of time with the manuscript trying to find a narrative and a character arc for St. John and all the supporting cast around him. And that was very interesting for me. The life of St. John the Short is actually really exciting to read. A lot of people only know him for the story of the Tree of Obedience, where Abba Amoy brings a dry and dead stick to him and tells him to water it every single day for 3 years. And St. John did just that out of obedience and love for his Abba. And then this stick started giving fruit and growing into a beautiful tree. But his life goes way beyond that. A lot of people don't know that he was roommates to Saint Bishoy. A lot of people don't know that he taught Abba Arsenius, and that his life had a lot to do with Saint Macarius and Saint Anthony. And not only that, but he came almost like a second generation after Saint Anthony and Saint Macarius, and so he was a little kid hearing about these great desert fathers, and because he was inspired by them, he pursued a life of virtue. Process-wise, I actually use the same method as modern-day comics. I start in blue pencils, thumbnailing the whole book, trying to find visual poetry, meaning that if something is happening in St. John's life, and then almost the same thing happens later on, I try to make these visually similar, so it gives the reader a signal that this is something happening because of this other or previous event. To give you an example, like when St. John was trying to join the monastery under Abba Amoy, and Abba Amoy was telling him how serious of a decision that is, I drew that in a very specific way. And then later on, when someone was trying to join the monastery and St. John was telling them how serious of a decision that is, I drew it in a similar fashion. And that gives the reader the signal that this is something that St. John is doing because he learned previously from Abba Amoy. So finding that poetry, finding that visual direction throughout the book really helps to connect the story together. After thumbnails comes inks, and I love inking. I use Black India ink and anything at my disposal to put it on paper. I use sponges, brushes, microns, brush pens, metal quills, anything to texturize it and give it that grit of the Egyptian desert. Visually, it actually looks very similar to ancient iconography. That bold two-dimensional line work. I love how ancient icons and modern graphic novels and modern comics have that visual storytelling style in common. A Forest in the Desert is for Christians seeking truth and desert wisdom. It's for parents trying to introduce their children to one of the great saints of our church, or for servants trying to start a discussion on virtues and living a Christ-centered life. It's also a great way for you to support everything Creative Orthodox. There are a lot of costs involved in making a website and sharing these stories, and so every book you get helps me with that. So get it. If you already have it, leave an Amazon review. Amazon's helped self-published authors immensely, and help me get these Orthodox stories out in the world, and I'll keep making them. Go to creativeorthodox.com to get a copy or buy it on Amazon.